Thursday, October 5th.
The squat has been fairly quiet for several days now, and the noises of metal scrapping even seem to have become much less frequent. In the afternoon we had the visit of some school kids from a school down the road, who came with two of their teachers to bring us lots of tins of food, packets of biscuits and rolls of toilet paper. We gave them a cup of tea, and Alex even turned up out of the blue with some chocolates that he'd brought across the road to distribute to the kids. He obviously enjoyed seeing their surprised and happy faces. I took the kids around the building, and this being Gyro Day, again, there were very few people around, and the kids asked us, "Does anybody live here?" They asked this even though they had seen several of us in the kitchen. They said, "Can we see them?" Obviously expecting the sight of some extraordinary beings. By then we were passing Richard's room, and they could see him through the window, his enormous and ill-clad body thrown on the bed amid scraps of paper and bread, and hear him snoring and smell the powerful odour of his feet, and they seemed very satisfied. A little after they left, we started cooking leisurely, picking the best ingredients from the just donated tins of food, e.g. wine sauce, to prepare a choice vegetable curry. Several visitors came in, including Joke, who turned out to be a really humorous guy. He's built and dressed like a Hell's Angel, with a dirty t-shirt under his leather jacket, chains around his waist and wrists, heavy boots, earrings, and extremely short dyed hair, red on one side and green on the other. I've often seen him begging at the Oval Tube Station, and he visits us from time to time. He came with a little baby in a pushchair whom he claimed was his, the mother having left him a year ago. There was another baby around, belonging to Sharon's sister, who was also popping in. Soon there were a whole dozen of us in the kitchen, and it was complete anarchy. Don, who had got his cheque earlier in the day, brought several bottles of beer and started distributing them liberally. Everyone was trying to contribute something to the cooking. Rachel got at Pauline for starving the rat she recently bought in a pet shop. Joke had everyone rolling about with laughter. The babies kept making a fuss. The noise was incredible. We were all happily eating together in the dark, because we're out of candles, with our fingers, because we're out of spoons, when Marianne came in. Everyone shut up. She was wearing a big black coat, her neck was stuck in a thick plastic collar, and she had a sad and absent look. She was returning from hospital with Dave. She'd stubbornly refused to stay there overnight. According to Dave, Marianne has an incurable bone disease. I think it's spondylitis. She may live another 6 weeks, another 6 months, another 6 years. God knows. She'll be taken next Tuesday to an old people's home. Nobody can help it, he says. Marianne doesn't want to go there. She prefers to stay in this derelict building, without electricity, without heating, without toilets, without hot water, but with friends who care for her and value her. A place where she can wash the dishes and sweep the floor and find joy in doing something for her friends. We don't want Marianne to go either. She's a precious part of the community. Of course she drives people round the bend from time to time, and if you upset her she will curse you silly, but most people deeply care for her. Someone even gave her a watch for her birthday.
Friday, October 6th.
A nice, peaceful day. Marianne spends most of her time in bed, and different people look after her from time to time. Once in a while she goes for a round or comes down to the kitchen to get some tea or have a chat. 2 journalists came from inside housing, Giovanni and Gordon. They were quite friendly and positive and spent some time with Marianne. They also interviewed Pauline and she really took them for a ride. It's a pity that every visitor or journalist is bound to get a misleading impression of the place because the atmosphere changes all the time, and it's this variety which makes the real life of the squat. Usually they're also misled because they talk to 1 or 2 people and think that they figured out what the Belgrave squatters feel about this or that. Pauline told Giovanni for the fun of it that our squat was so cosy that it made Buckingham Palace look like a hut. And he printed this word for word in the article, as if she'd really meant it. The kitchen is still thriving. John, Richard and I each have a key to the storeroom, which works well because we're all fairly hard working and we tend to be up around different times. Greg also hangs around the kitchen a lot. Like Richard, he loves cooking and eating, and he's always happy to get up and do something.
Saturday, October 7th.
Came to the squat at dawn, armed with buckets of leftover food I had been given by the cafe. On the way I met Gordon, a Scottish dosser, thin, rough, slow-witted, who turns up once in a while but doesn't socialise much. He told me that he had lived in the squat for several months, but that he only came to sleep. Later in the day, I was with Greg in Marianne's room when we heard someone snoring. This seemed weird because there's no room adjacent to Marianne's, only a very narrow passage with some cupboards in it. Just out of curiosity, we opened the door to the passage, and after our eyes got used to the darkness, we distinguished a body on the floor and recognised Gordon. So, this chap has been living in there, unnoticed, for several months, sneaking in at dawn and going out again after his nap, glad to have found a place to lay his head, and above all concerned not to get into trouble, and therefore keeping rather aloof. We closed the door on his deafening snores and had a good laugh. The Bobby-Rachel saga took a dramatic turn today, with Rachel leaving the squat surreptitiously while Bobby was fast asleep. He'd taken a large dose of Valium. Just before that, she came to me and told me that she desperately wanted to take this unique chance to escape, but that she needed some money to go home. I borrowed £20 from Pat Gaffney and gave them to her. On the doorsteps, I asked her, "Does this mean I'll never see you again?" She said, "No, but I won't forget this," and gave me a hug before shooting off. God knows what Bobby will do to me if he finds out. We had another jolly dinner in the evening. Fried rice and peanut sauce, a great success. Max was around again. For once, Bobby joined the crowd too, rather disheartened, asking if anyone had seen his love. But even though the word has already spread about Rachel's escape, there's a conspiracy of silence about it, everyone being on her side. Later in the evening, I found Marianne alone in her room in a rather sad state. As one might expect, people get tired of nursing a sick person, and this evening there was no one to look after her. Besides the batteries of the little electric lamp she brought back from the hospital were flat, and her room was plunged into darkness. Her radio wasn't working either. Greg fixed the lamp and the radio. I brought her some soup, and the two of us kept her company for a while. Soon she was cheerfully chattering again. But much as we would all like Marianne to stay with us, she will clearly have to go soon. This place is just too primitive for an old person in poor health. Later, Brother Adrian came for his weekly food delivery. Our freezer and stores are now brimming over with victuals, not only staples such as bread and carrots, but also many delicacies such as asparagus, strawberries, chocolate, and what have you. Good for the morale. Meanwhile, Steve broke into a prayer meeting at St. Mark's after having drunk a large number of bottles of beer and started shouting that he was the devil and that he'd come to torment the worshippers. The congregation was up in arms, and some of the bolder members rushed to Steve and told him to be calm, to trust in Jesus, and that Jesus would drive the demon out of him. Dave, who happened to be there, told him not to be funny and that Steve was just soaked, and he dragged Steve away. The next morning, Steve couldn't remember a thing as usual when he drinks, but he went to St. Mark's to apologise.
Sunday, October 8th.
Rachel came back today. I couldn't believe my eyes. She seemed so sure about her decision yesterday and so determined not to come back. But now she says she just discovered that she's pregnant. And of course she will have the baby, and she's happy about it. Bobby is over the moon and goes around telling everyone about Rachel being pregnant. The whole thing is quite perplexing. I can't help wondering whether there is really the slightest chance that those two will be happy parents when there's so much immaturity, so much instability, and so much tension in their relationship. But the heart has reasons that reason cannot fathom. In the morning we had our Sunday clean up of the whole building. There was an atmosphere of great zeal, and within a few hours the place was transformed. Later I went with Dave and Ray to Ian McGowan's to sort out the freezer and bring back some food to the squat. As we were coming back with, among other things, 2 bags of sandwiches, we crossed paths with a scruffy and cheerless tramp. Dave and I were doing our best not to notice him too much, as one often does in such a situation, but Ray went straight to him and asked him if he wanted a sandwich. The poor devil naturally didn't say no, and Ray proceeded to extract the very best sandwiches from his bag. It must have been salmon or something like that, and to give them to the tramp. Ray was delighted with this good trick.
Monday, October 9th.
Out most of the day, I've decided to start reducing my involvement with number 1 Clapham Road. The sad moment is drawing near when it will be time to move on, and it may help to withdraw gradually.
Tuesday, October 10th.
After getting up this morning, I found Marianne sitting in the kitchen giving hell to Lucy. Lucy, a trendy young woman, is her social worker. She came this morning to take Marianne to see yet another old people's home, but Marianne refused to go. And as Dave says, Lucy doesn't know how to talk to Marianne. She's not strong enough, that's what Dave says. And Marianne can wrap around her little finger just like that. So Lucy was just sitting there in silence, looking extremely annoyed, putting up with Marianne's ranting and raving. Nobody will tell me where I have to go. We all came back here together after the fire, after the police told us not to come back, and we will stay together. I won't do what you tell me to do. I'll do what they tell me to do, etc. And all this interspersed with her usual cryptic rambling, as well as with ugly abuses addressed at Lucy. I felt sorry for Lucy, who has the best of intentions, but there was obviously no way of reasoning with Marianne on this particular subject, so instead I invited Lucy to have a cup of tea at the cafe round the corner. She explained to me how she had tried hard to rehouse Marianne for the last few months, with no result. Marianne even refused to consider moving to the home for women next door to the squat. At one point she called Marianne a silly old witch, but I think that this was a delayed reaction to the flood of abuses she had endured, and that she didn't really mean it. In the middle of all this, while we were sitting in the kitchen, Marianne, Lucy, Arthur and myself and 1 or 2 others, 2 journalists from South London Press turned up. We've had problems with South London Press journalists in the past. They've written rather slanderous stories about the squat from time to time, and Arthur spent a whole hour arguing with these two and questioning their intentions. Finally, they had to abandon their hopes and go back without a scoop. They had come to write a spicy or heartbreaking story about the poor and the homeless, and instead received a long lecture about the ethics of journalism from someone who was far more articulate than they were.
Wednesday, October 11th.
Things have been rather quiet and peaceful so far this week, and today again nothing very dramatic happened except for Steve being locked up for begging. But a recurrent irritation comes from the noises of metal scrapping and from the conspiracy of silence that surrounds the whole business. Most of us resent this situation, but when I ask why we don't have a frank discussion about it with Og and Max, I'm told that they don't like to talk about it openly. At one point, all this was more than I could bear, and I made my way in the direction of the noises and found Muzzy, who came back yesterday with Sarah, and Ringo taking lead off the roof near my room. This is very antisocial because the roof can start leaking as a result. I didn't know what to do or say because I felt too angry inside to speak in a constructive way, and sounding provocative can be quite dangerous with someone like Ringo. So I just stood there and they carried on, pretending not to notice me, though Ringo raised his head at one stage and said, "Can I help you?" which was clearly an invitation to push off. A few seconds later, Dave appeared on the scene, and unlike me, he didn't hesitate to tell them off. He said something about the building being constantly watched by the police, and that the council wouldn't help us if they found out that we were vandalising the building. On a different tack, I added that this building was also a home, and that what they were doing could cause the roof to leak. None of this had any effect, though Muzzy did mumble that this part of the building had been sealed off after the fire, and I have to admit that he was right. Late in the afternoon, 2 policemen came to check that Steve so-and-so lived with us, explaining he'd been arrested and they had to verify his address before giving him bail. The name didn't mean anything to us since we only know each other's Christian names, and there are several Steves around. But the police said we could go to Bow Street Police Station and identify him. Bow Street is very near Covent Garden, where I had to meet a friend a little later, so I said I would go. 2 hours later, I was walking out of the police station with Fat Steve, who had been arrested for begging. He had been quite rowdy in the police station, shouting like a devil and ferociously banging his fists on the door of his cell in the hope of hurting himself and being taken to hospital. The first thing he did to celebrate his unexpected freedom was to buy a few cans of beer. The police had given him his begging money back. And I accompanied him for a while on his way back to the squat, sipping beer and listening to the hilarious stories. He was confident that he would get a 6-month conditional discharge the next day if the magistrate turned out to be a man, 12 if it was a woman. We walked together through Cardboard City, where Steve has lived in the past, and he gave me a peculiar lecture about the people who live there. They are really lazy and stupid. Believe me, if they are really cold and hungry, why don't they get off their arse and go begging?
Thursday, October 12th.
Out most of the day again. I'm told that Roger Taylor, the agent of the owner of the building, came around. He explained that the owner had the intention of selling the building soon, and that we would have to go soon after Christmas. The kitchen arrangements went through a short crisis with someone kicking in the door of the storeroom, and John, who works really hard to feed people, angrily resigning in protest and throwing the padlock of the storeroom through the window. Throughout the day, the kitchen was in a most depressing state, with food and dirty dishes strewn all over the place and no one doing anything about it. But by the evening, things were somehow back to normal. The padlock had been fixed and John was cooking again. For the first time, I had a long talk with Bobby. I have to admit that Bobby is one of the very few people here for whom I don't feel an instinctive liking, partly because of the way he treats Rachel, and partly because of his parasitic lifestyle and antisocial attitudes. He lives entirely off of Rachel's begging, doesn't pay his rent, rarely helps around, and takes as much advantage of the community as he possibly can. But this conversation gave me a chance to see the better side of Bobby's personality, and I feel sorry for having misjudged him so harshly. The poor chap is now absolutely desperate. Rachel left him again 2 days after coming back, and it's now the 3rd day since she disappeared. Bobby loves her madly, and he kept bursting into tears. Tomorrow is her 19th birthday, and he can't bear the thought of having to spend that day alone with the presents he got for her. Worse, a relative of Rachel told him that she was going to have an abortion, and although he doesn't believe it, Rachel is over the moon about being pregnant. The sheer thought that this might happen is a torture to him. I took this opportunity to ask him why they spend so much time fighting and why he beats her up so often. But much as he felt sorry about it, he just couldn't explain it, though he said something vague about the need to make sure that one is not being taken for a ride. Steve got a 6-month conditional discharge, and the magistrate was a man.
Friday, October 13th.
I was out all day today and came back only around 11 in the evening. As I walked past the Oval tube station, I found Craig begging in the most extraordinary punk attire with his hair nicely arranged in a spike. I inquired about the state of his relationship with Pauline. Like Rachel and Bobby and Muzzy and Sarah, they keep threatening to split. And he said that he was still with her by the skin of me teeth. She deserves someone better than me. Talking about teeth, he added that he had just seen John going to the hospital with Greg with his lips badly cut and a couple of teeth missing after Ringo had punched him in the face. The reason apparently is that John objected to Ringo walking into the kitchen storeroom while it was open and helping himself to a whole bag of tinned food. We've recently received a lot of tinned food from churches donated as part of the harvest tradition to gift food to the poor. I said I had seen Ringo doing that once or twice in the past and that it got on my nerves too, though I had not openly objected to it. Craig advised me in the strongest terms not to get in Ringo's way, told me that you don't fuck around with Ringo, and that he was schizophrenic. He added that once Max in person had hit Ringo behind the ear with an axe, and that Ringo had just stood there laughing. This is not the first time I've heard such stories. On another occasion, Ringo is said to have confronted 2 chaps armed with machetes, himself equipped only with a knife. His opponents suggested that they should all throw their weapons and fight bare-handed, but he refused, and there was no fight. John himself once explained to me that if he had to face Ringo armed with a double-barreled gun, he would still be scared. I felt relieved that I hadn't confronted Ringo provocatively last Wednesday when he was scrapping lead from the roof with Muzzy. The relief was short-lived. As I was making my way to my room through the pitch-black corridors a little later, I suddenly heard someone saying, "Who's that?" And the next thing I knew was that Ringo in person had torn my shirt and grabbed my neck with his steel-like hand. I only have a patchy memory of what followed. The first thing he told me was to follow him to the backyard or he would kill me. It was hardly necessary for him to use this threat, because meanwhile he was practically carrying me in front of him. He made it clear that he was going to give me the thrashing of my life, and added, "I don't care what happens after this. I already faced several years in prison." Unlike when Max threatened me with his giant hammer, I was shit scared. What terrified me was not so much the prospect of getting a beating of reasonable proportion that I've known all along could happen any day, but rather the feeling of this uncontrollable force, and the thought that if for any reason he lost his temper, he could really tear me apart. My imagination singularly failed me in this hour of desperate need, and I was at a loss to find something to say that would save my skin. All I could do was to ask him not to beat me up. And what good would it do? And what was the matter anyway? In reply to this, he referred to the incident that happened on the roof on Wednesday, and he said, "You tried to stop me from doing an honest job." This was a revealing remark, and while I tried to explain again why I thought it was a bad idea to scrap lead from the roof, I could see how, in his own value scale, this was perhaps a perfectly harmless activity. He also referred to the fact that I had once locked the kitchen storeroom just as he was about to help himself to some food. Food that you get for free anyway. Again, while I tried to explain to him why I thought it wasn't right for someone who didn't live here to raid our stores, I could see his point. Both of us were quite calm during this exchange, though we were very tense inside, he with anger and me with fear. All along he continued to utter various threats between his teeth. He called me a foreign cunt and said something about having fought for this country. He used to be in the army. He also mentioned, "I know that you have 6 A-levels, but I don't give a shit," which was another revealing remark and would have been incredibly funny in other circumstances. The backyard was approaching fast, and the whole situation seemed utterly hopeless. The only glimmer of hope was that Fat Steve was also around. Steve happens to be a good friend of Ringo. They were walking together down the corridor when Ringo had grabbed me. And of course, he's also a great pal of mine. Needless to say, there is no way that Steve could restrain Ringo, nor did he try to. But he patiently followed us around and pleaded ceaselessly on my behalf, invoking all the arguments he could think of. "Please, Ringo, don't beat him up. He's okay. He got me out of the nick the other day. He's going in a few days anyway. This guy did a lot for the place," etc. It's again revealing that Steve thought Ringo might be sensitive to the last argument. I lost all hope again when, having reached the backyard, Ringo punched me in the face. I fell on the ground, but either because he missed the target or because he pulled his punch, my face was intact. A single blow had been enough to send John to the hospital. Steve helped me get up, and he told me to face Ringo, the last thing I wanted to do. I was expecting the worst when Muzzy and Sarah appeared on the scene, out of the blue, and Sarah joined Steve in asking Ringo not to hurt me. Ringo seemed to hesitate, and then his attitude started changing. He became more receptive, and as he was dragging me back inside the building, some kind of a dialogue was at last beginning to emerge. The essence of his argument was that I should learn to respect people. I said that I did respect him, which is true, and I asked him why he didn't come and live with us again. He replied that this place has gone to the dogs, and the discussion drifted to less personal matters, much to my relief. Finally he left, Muzzy at last opened his mouth to ask me if I was okay. The coward had kept quiet all along. I shook Steve's hand and he said, "I think we're quits now. Put it this way, you're lucky I was there." Yes, it was a real miracle that Steve happened to be there, that for once he was not too drunk, that he is a friend of Ringo's, and that he owes me a favour. After this narrow escape, my instinct was to leave the squat and never come back again, or at least not come back until the next day, but I felt it would be wrong to yield to intimidation, so I made my way to my room and tried to sleep. My room is in an otherwise empty corridor, and Ringo often keeps his dog, a ferocious Doberman, in one of the other rooms. I was absolutely terrified at the thought that he might come back to get his dog and on the way burst into my room and settle scores with me in Steve's absence. At one point I heard his voice in the corridor, but there was a female voice too, and when she asked him, "Is this your room?" as they were entering the dog's room, I heard him reply, "No, I have a squat down the road." And after they left, I finally managed to sleep. However unpleasant, this experience was full of lessons. I can better understand now why people keep their mouth shut about the whole metal scrapping business. On the negative side, there's quite simply the fear of violence. On the positive side, what Ringo has taught me is that an explosive place like this can only survive if people make an effort to mind their own business. As far as he is concerned, scrapping metal from a building that is going to be evacuated soon is not a particularly reprehensible activity, and I have to admit that so far the living areas have been left intact. Who was I to get in his way? Another thing that came through tonight is Ringo's own frame of mind. Among other things, he probably resents the fact that someone like me commands more influence than he does in the community, just as a result of being more articulate. Many people consider Ringo as another brainless dinosaur, and he must feel entitled to greater respect. Can I blame him for asserting himself in his own way? The question remains how a community like ours can deal with this kind of behaviour. This would be easy enough if there was a real awareness of the problem and a common determination to handle it in a non-authoritarian way. For instance, we could agree that, should an incident of this kind happen, everyone would gather around the people who are being violent and tell them to stop. The fact that Steve and Sarah managed to prevent Ringo from beating me up is one indication that this system might work, but it would take a lot of time and patience to build up the required commitment to a non-violent form of conflict resolution.
Saturday, October 14th.
Today, I accompanied Marianne to the Delos community in Wellingborough. The Delos community was founded a few years ago by Jean Steinhardt, a wonderful woman who helped start the squat last January and has remained a faithful supporter ever since. Jean is planning to invite Marianne to join the Delos community, and today's visit was a prelude to this risky suggestion. I spent an hour with Marianne in the kitchen in the afternoon waiting for Jean to come. Ringo was around, much to my apprehension, but he didn't seem to mind my presence. He came into the kitchen a couple of times with his dog and even sat near me once. I wanted to talk to him, but I felt too nervous. John left the squat, disgusted with Ringo's behaviour. His departure is a great loss. He was a very genuine guy who did a lot to make this place work, particularly by cooking delicious meals, and had a good deal of good sense and goodwill in spite of being stoned half the time. He was a true grassroots revolutionary, a homeless dropout who had no political programme, but whose practical idealism sowed seeds of change. Marianne, who didn't know why he had left, also felt sad about it and said, "It would have been nice if we had his picture, wouldn't it?" John's departure also leaves a void in the kitchen. The door of the storeroom has been kicked in again, and after what happened to John, no one seems inclined to put another lock on the door and keep the keys. Nor is anyone cooking for the community. The kitchen is a free-for-all, with dirty dishes all over the place, and the food reserves dwindling fast. This too is depressing. More heartening is the fact that there are quite a few new faces around, young and old, black and white, male and female. I was particularly happy to see that Fran had moved in again. Fran is a young woman who used to live in the bullring and did her bit to start this squat. On the day when we took over, she hijacked a whole tray of Salvation Army sandwiches from the bullring and brought it all the way to Clapham Road, just to support us. She stayed with us for a while when she was pregnant and then moved out again as she was about to deliver. The baby died soon after being born. After that, I believe that she spent some time in various homes for drug addicts and that she managed to give up drugs. She told me that she is now staying in the little building across the backyard called The Lodge with Max and her husband. She's full of enthusiasm and energy, and I think that she'll be a great asset to the community. While Marianne and I were waiting in the kitchen, she burst into tears from time to time, lamenting, "It's not fair, is it?" I finally understood that she was referring to the fact that she hadn't seen much of Dave for the last few days, and not at all today. For some reason, Dave seems to have been avoiding her recently, perhaps because he needs some release from the stress of looking after her all the time. It occurred to me that Marianne's feelings for Dave may be nothing short of being in love with him. Finally, Jean Steinhardt came with a van and a few friends, and we all drove to Wellingborough. The Delos community, which provides a home for persons with mental handicaps, is a very inspiring place, and a lot of what I saw there reminded me of the squat itself. Social rejects building a new society, friends finding joy in doing something for each other, so-called useless people who have been healed by community living. One of them spoke for the first time in 9 years to say that he didn't want to leave. Marianne found herself immediately at home there, and soon she and Mary were walking down the road, hand in hand, each convinced that she was helping the other. Marianne rambling about how Audrey hoards 20 mugs in her room, and Mary replying in the same vein that she had suspected it all along and that hopefully things would improve after the winter. Marianne had a hot bath, and I could hardly recognise her with her beautiful snow-white hair flowing on all sides. We slept in a warm house with electric lights that you can turn on just by flicking a switch, with no fire risk and no Ringo. And should some ruffian have come to the door and caused trouble, all we had to do was to leave him on the other side, and if he didn't go away, we could call the police, and they would remove him like some smelly garbage. I wouldn't hesitate to stay here if I were Marianne, but of course she has nothing to fear from Ringo. He calls her love, and his Doberman likes to put his head in her lap.
Sunday, October 15th.
I went back to London in the afternoon, leaving Marianne behind and telling her that I would come back again soon or send Dave. On the train, I was considering the prospect of returning to Clapham Road with great apprehension. With fear fueling my imagination, I could think of many reasons why Ringo might still want to beat me up. Perhaps he would find it insulting that, unlike John, I didn't flee in fear. Perhaps John would complain to the police and they would come looking for Ringo. and Ringo would think that it was me. Perhaps he felt frustrated that Steve had stopped him from teaching me a lesson and was waiting for the next chance. Perhaps last Wednesday's incident had only been a pretext for beating me up, and he had deeper motives to want to get rid of me. Or perhaps Og did, and he had asked Ringo to persuade me to leave the squat. Aside from this, I was wondering what would happen at the weekly meeting, whether it would be the right thing to do to raise the issue of violence, and how Ringo would take it, not kindly, for sure. I also expected to find the place in a real mess, given the way things were going yesterday. Altogether, I was feeling very weary as I approached the squat, which for once seemed to me like the grimmest place on earth. Once again, I was completely taken by surprise. I found that a revolutionary atmosphere had gripped number 1 Clapham Road, like we hadn't experienced since the fire. Fran had taken over the kitchen, which was immaculate, and the stores were full with fresh supplies delivered yesterday by brother Adrian. Smurf, whom I've never seen working, was conscientiously mopping the floor. Others, led by Max, were tidying the backyard, which is a hard and thankless job. Scum and Ray were busy repairing bicycles. Fran was going round giving people tea, and everyone seemed to be in a relaxed and friendly mood. Even Arthur was gaily mixing with the crowd for once, teasing us by saying that on days like this, even he fell into the trap of thinking that there was some hope for this squat. A lot of this seemed to be the effect of Fran getting everyone else moving. I met Ringo in the corridor, and to my delight, he mumbled, "Hi, Jean," a reassuring sign that he wants peace. We had an excellent meeting too. Most of those present in the building came, about 20 people. Even Eddie was there this time. It was very informal. No one was chairing, but the discussion was orderly and constructive. Even Max, who's disrupted so many meetings, made some helpful suggestions. Ringo came in at one stage, but left after a few minutes without having said a word. We discussed a number of practicalities: a letter from Arnold Porter, the toilets, the garbage, the kitchen, the electricity, Marianne, a donation of £1,000 made by the Billy Graham Trust to the Brixton Council of Churches on our behalf. Bless you, Billy. It was decided that at least until we get the much-awaited electricity connection, the rent would be abolished, given that we are now getting all our food for free. Hardly anybody has been paying rent lately either way. Max and Greg volunteered to help move some furniture that's being donated to us. Fran thanked everyone for helping with today's clean-up and exhorted people to keep it up. This was hardly the time to raise the divisive issue of violence, especially since I didn't have anything concrete to suggest. So I was happy to take this excuse not to do it. There was a familiar atmosphere of zeal and goodwill after the meeting. To my disbelief, I even found Muzzy and Sarah emptying the toilets. This is a turning point in the history of the squat, because adorable as they are, those two hardly ever lift a finger to help, and on occasions, usually when they're on drugs, they have been even the cause of quite a bit of vandalism. I started giving them a hand, and as we were rinsing the buckets, a journalist and a photographer from South London Guardian turned up and said that they wanted to see our facilities. I showed them the tap and the buckets and told them it was all in front of them. They then asked for our permission to go around taking photographs and talking to people. I said that we had no authority to give them such a permission, that personally I had no objection at all, but that others among us take a much less kindly view of journalists. Smurf added that there were many people who are not keen at all to be photographed. They proceeded. From what I heard later, they soon appeared in the common room where a group of people were having a cup of tea and seeing Eddie, and presumably thinking that they were not taking any major risk by approaching this old man, went straight to him. This was overlooking Bobby, who sensed their intentions and pounced on them, vociferously accusing them of trying to take advantage of a helpless old man before moving on to more general grievances about the press establishment. They retreated in panic and walked out. I felt sorry for them. They were partly the victims of the bitterness that Bobby feels at having missed Rachel's birthday. But the general suspicion against the press also appears to be much deeper than I thought, and I was roundly blamed for letting them in. Someone said there ought to be a padlock on the gate, and I took this opportunity to produce the padlock and bell that I've been keeping in my room all this time. Muzzy promptly put both on the gate. Well, I don't know if this is a really good idea, but there's no harm trying. Nothing is permanent in this squat. I left, munching some raspberries in the sunset, feeling happy. The time has come to move on, and when I come back, it will just be to pack my belongings and say goodbye. I'm under no illusion that today's euphoria will endure. It's a rowdy crowd that lives at number 1, and there will be more storms. I've already heard complaints that Fran was too pushy, and even allegations that she was a dangerous woman. But our ship is also a solid one. It's wonderful to be able to leave on a cheerful note. On the way I bumped into Bill. I could barely recognise the man who had so happily helped me to mop the ground floor 6 weeks ago and told me off the next day. He had all the appearances of a demented tramp who has ruined his life forever. His clothes were in rags, his hands and face were covered with a thick layer of dirt. He was drunk and shouting angrily around. I gave him some of the sandwiches and raspberries that Fran had given me for the journey. I remembered the very first meeting we'd had in the squat, on the first day, January the 23rd, when there had only been a dozen of us around, half of whom looked just like Bill. I remembered wondering against my will, can these people really do something for themselves? They have.
A farewell.
I met Richard twice again. The first time I saw him from a distance limping through Kennington Park, pushing a supermarket trolley in front of him, looking into dustbins for food. He explained to me that he had left the squat after getting in trouble with Louise and her friends. As far as I understood from his extremely long-winded and garbled account, some sensitive jokes about sexual practices in the squat degenerated into a quarrel, and he repelled an attack from Louise a little less gently than he had wished, after which he was asked to leave. I was in a great rush, so I asked him if we could meet the next morning at the Aldwych. He said yes. I found him the next morning at the Aldwych at the appointed time. He was lying in a doorway on a piece of cardboard which he had presumably used as a bed. The crowd was passing by, trying hard not to notice him, embarrassed by this incongruous presence, this scruffy dropout staring at the world. The wind was blowing and the sky was grey. Gone were the pickles, the bubble and squeaks, the carrot wine, the long siestas, the debates about the poll tax and animal rights in the middle of the night. I had brought some food and we went to Lincoln's Inn Fields to have our breakfast on a bench. We talked about the squat and agreed that it had been a beautiful thing. We had an argument about whether anarchist ideals were compatible with violent methods. He gave me a moving account of the hour-long interrogation he had had to suffer from the social services in his attempt to make a second social security claim. He found himself completely penniless soon after making the first claim a few weeks ago, partly because he had given or lent half of his money to other people in the squat. We parted on the corner of Lincoln's Inn Fields in a brief ray of sunshine. I tried hard to find a way of keeping in touch with him, or of being able to trace him next time I'm in London. But it's impossible. He has no contact address, and if I give him mine, he will lose it within 3 days. He has no stable anchor or friends. He's in London today, perhaps he'll be in Glasgow tomorrow, or in prison. I had a keen sense of losing a great friend forever, someone I profoundly admired and cared for. This diary is dedicated to him.
Finished, except for there are some of the press reports that he mentions in the book included, so we will photograph them and put them up. Unsurprisingly and rather depressingly, it is now a building of luxury flats. This is a bit of copy that we found online on an estate agent website. At only £600,000, this stunning 2-bedroom apartment is set within the beautiful Grade 2 listed building, which was formerly Belgrave Hospital. The property has some stunning features, including a vaulted ceiling and mezzanine level. It also offers a massive 23-foot reception, fitted kitchen, modern bathroom, and much more. The property is just moments from Oval Station and local amenities. Properties within this development are rarely seen on the market, so call now for viewing to avoid disappointment.
They carefully neglected to mention that it was an autonomous homeless squat, didn't they?